I'm Melinda. As we begin this study together of Meister Eckhart for Lent, let's start with a brief biography of this man so we know a little bit about him as we read his works. Meister Eckhart, also known as Eckhart Hochheim, was born in Erfurt, Germany in 1260. Although he's known as Meister, that was a title he acquired later in life. Many scholars think his real first name was Johannes. Eckhart entered the Dominican novitiate in Erfurt sometime in his middle to late teens, and then in 1280 we know he was sent to study at the renowned Dominican House of Study in Cologne. In his time there, he took up the thought of Thomas Aquinas, a fellow Dominican who'd only died a few years later, and Aquinas exercised a lot of influence on Eckhart's thinking. In addition to his studies, he was most likely associated with, or at least knew of, the mysticism flourishing in the Rhineland that had a huge impact on him also. Upon finishing his studies, he was ordained a priest, and then he was sent to the premier University of Paris to study for the Master of Theology. When he returned to Germany, he was elected prior of the house in Erfurt, and also vicar over the region's Dominican houses. Because of his obligation in administration, it wasn't until 1302 that he actually acquired his degree and became known as Meister. Eckhart's organizational leadership must have been skillful, as he was elected to serve first over the province in Saxony, which included Erfurt, and was charged with providing guidance to the Dominican nuns in the area. After his 4-year term, he was next elected to serve the same kind of post in Bohemia, charged with reforming houses there. We know that he must have done well because he built 3 new houses and was then further elected to serve in another post. That said, he didn't take up that last post because the General Chapter of Dominicans instead sent him back to Paris as lecturer, a considerable honor, given most people serve only 1 term in Paris. Recalled to Germany in 1313, he became a spiritual director and professor in Strasbourg. Shortly thereafter, he was elected prior, made vicar of the area, and charged with oversight of Dominican nuns. The number of Dominican nuns was large and increasing, perhaps because of the Dominican emphasis on both study and mysticism. He also oversaw many Beguine houses, women who were not formally vowed in any order, but who lived together in pursuit of the spiritual life. The sermons he gave were often to women, who wrote them down and preserved them for the ages. The mysticism that flourished in the Rhineland involved many women, and those who lived before Eckhart certainly influenced his thinking. In 1322, Eckhart returned to Cologne, but his tenure was short. Eckhart was charged with heresy 3 years into his time there, and he had to appear before the Inquisition. Fear of heterodoxy was running rampant, and Eckhart's sermons were brought to trial, a formal trial, in an ecclesial court. Eckhart answered to a tribunal, and then effectively had his case placed before the Pope, a privilege granted to those who'd been to the university. From what records remain and what scholars can piece together, Eckhart seems to have been caught in the growing controversy between Franciscans and Dominicans, in the broader context of the Avignon papacy, with questions of authority and poverty and spirituality all creating conflicts. It's fascinating if that's your thing, but it'd be rather a rabbit hole here. So, to the point, Eckhart went to Avignon to defend himself, and he died there. We don't know where, we don't know how. And to that end, Eckhart asserted he was not a heretic, because that implied a will to be a heretic, which he had never willed. So if his writings were deemed heretical, it was an error, and it was an accident. The Pope issued a bull following his death that condemned 28 of Eckhart's charged articles, but not condemning Eckhart himself or any of his other writings. Despite not being charged with heresy, the stain remained, and many scholars and folks in general think that this is why Eckhart is maybe less known. Or perhaps it's because he never found the time to pull all of his thinking into a giant work, like Aquinas did with his Summa. Eckhart was, however, not just an academic. In fact, he was mostly a Dominican friar, preaching regularly and issuing spiritual advice. He lived what he preached, and believed that finding God in the everyday affairs of one's life was the key to finding God in general. He averred mystical experiences, setting him apart from so many of the people we think of mystics. Francis with his stigmata, Teresa with her visions, Julian with her cat attached to the church in Norwich. He believed one could come to the ground of their being in their everyday life, which is why he's so relevant to those of us not in cloisters, who are living our everyday lives in the work and with family and interested in finding God. Eckhart has a word for us, this man who was mystic and academic and preacher, who lived in fraught times and yet found God in the midst of it. So welcome to this formation series on Meister Eckhart.